These experiments were real, they were approved, and for decades they were hidden. The people involved were never informed. Years later, the US government finally admitted what happened. Throughout the 20th century, the United States invested heavily in scientific research tied to national security. War, geopolitical rivalry, and rapid technological change created an environment where experimentation was seen as necessary and often urgent. Within this environment, a dangerous assumption quietly took hold: that certain experiments were justified if they served a greater goal. Many government-funded programs began with legitimate objectives: understanding disease, improving military readiness, studying the effects of chemicals, radiation, or psychological stress. But in several cases, ethical boundaries were not clearly defined or deliberately ignored. What is most striking is not that experiments occurred, but how openly they were approved at the time. Oversight committees existed, but standards were inconsistent. Informed consent, as it is understood today, was not always required. Vulnerable populations were often chosen because they were accessible, controlled, and unlikely to challenge authority. These programs were not hidden from everyone. They were documented, funded, and discussed within institutional frameworks. The secrecy existed primarily between the government and the public. At the time, this was not considered unusual. The Cold War intensified the pressure. Officials feared falling behind adversaries. Scientific advantage was framed as survival. Under those conditions, ethical concerns were frequently deferred. The people involved in these experiments were rarely informed of the full purpose or risks. Some believed they were receiving medical treatment. Others were told they were participating in harmless studies. In many cases, participants had no idea they were part of an experiment at all. What followed was not a single scandal, but a pattern, repeated across decades and agencies. These experiments were not accidents. They were the product of a system that prioritized outcomes over individuals. One of the most disturbing aspects of America's secret experiments is how often informed consent was absent. In several documented cases, individuals were exposed to substances or conditions without being told the true nature of what was happening. Prisoners, hospital patients, military personnel, and marginalized communities were frequently selected. These groups shared one thing in common: limited power to refuse. In medical settings, patients believed they were receiving treatment. In reality, they were part of long-term studies designed to observe untreated diseases or experimental interventions. Some were deliberately denied effective care so researchers could track progression. Military personnel were also subjected to experiments. Exposure to chemicals, radiation, or extreme psychological stress was sometimes justified as preparation for battlefield conditions. Participants were told the risks were minimal. In many cases, long-term consequences were unknown or deliberately understated. Children were not exempt. In certain studies, minors were included under the authority of institutions or guardians who were not fully informed. The ethical framework we take for granted today did not yet exist. But that absence does not explain the deliberate withholding of information. Documents later released show that officials were aware of potential harm. Internal memos acknowledged risk, yet studies continued. The logic was simple and deeply flawed. The data was valuable and the subjects were replaceable. Some experiments went beyond physical testing and entered psychological territory. Studies explored how isolation, stress, drugs, and manipulation affected behavior. Researchers sought to understand how far the human mind could be pushed and controlled. These projects often involved deception. Subjects were misled about the purpose of the study. In some cases, they were observed without their knowledge. In others, substances were administered secretly. The goal was not curiosity, it was control. Officials wanted to know how individuals responded under pressure, how perception could be altered, how memory could be disrupted. These experiments were framed as defensive research, preparation for what enemies might attempt. But the methods were invasive, and the consequences long-lasting. Participants reported confusion, trauma, and psychological damage. Many were never informed that their experiences were part of a government-funded program. Years later, when records emerged, survivors struggled to reconcile what had happened to them with the institutions they once trusted. For decades, these experiments remained largely unknown to the public. Files were classified, programs were renamed or terminated quietly. Participants were left without explanations. Exposure came slowly. Investigative journalists uncovered fragments. Congressional hearings revealed patterns. Lawsuits forced the release of documents. Survivors came forward with similar stories. At first, official responses were defensive. Agencies denied responsibility or minimized harm. But as evidence accumulated, denial became impossible. Eventually, admissions followed. Presidents issued apologies. Compensation programs were established. Oversight laws were strengthened. Ethical standards were formalized. These acknowledgments were significant, but incomplete. Many records were destroyed. Others remained classified. Some victims never received recognition. The truth emerged not as a single revelation, but as a gradual erosion of secrecy. America's secret experiments did not end when programs were closed or documents were classified. Their consequences continued long after the research stopped. For many participants, the harm was never explained. Some lived with unexplained illnesses. Others experienced lasting psychological effects. Medical records were incomplete. Information was withheld. Responsibility remained unclear. When details finally emerged, they appeared slowly. Journalists uncovered fragments. Congressional hearings revealed patterns, not full histories. Declassified documents often confirmed misconduct, while concealing critical details through heavy redactions. The official response followed a familiar course. Initial denial shifted toward partial acknowledgement. In some cases, apologies were issued. Limited compensation programs were created. New rules governing research on human subjects were introduced. These actions mattered, but they were incomplete. Not all victims were identified. Not all records were released. Many affected individuals had already died before recognition arrived. For families, acknowledgement often came too late to provide closure. Modern research ethics did not develop naturally. Oversight committees, informed consent requirements, and institutional review boards were created in direct response to documented abuses. These safeguards exist because ethical boundaries were crossed. Even today, uncertainty remains. Some records were destroyed, others remain classified. The full scope of certain programs may never be known. These experiments changed how Americans view science, government, and authority. Progress is no longer assumed to be neutral. Power is no longer trusted without oversight. The lesson is not to fear science, but to recognize the human cost of secrecy. These stories endure because they warn. Accountability is not automatic. It must be demanded, maintained, and remembered.